The Infinite Enemy by Jack Williamson. Originally published in the April 1938 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories magazine. It was not republished until 1999, when it was included in an anthology entitled Griffon Science Fiction and Fantasy Reader No. 1. In 2002, it was to be found in a collection of Williamson's stories called Spider Island, The Collected Stories of Jack Williamson, Volume 4. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Chapter 1. Into Enigma. This was going to be a tough proposition, but Carrie Lundoon summoned a happy whistle to his lips and walked jauntily up to the guarded gate of the Callant Memorial Foundation. "You get the Winship story, Lundy," his editor had ordered. "And I don't care how, bribe a guard or bump him off. I want to know what Winship is doing inside that fence." "Yes, Chief." "Don't yes, Chief. Get the copy. For 15 years, Winship's laboratory has been a mystery, ever since the atomic explosion, or whatever it was, that killed Dr. Callant and his daughter back in 1948. Cedric Callant was the biggest scientist of his time, and Roger Winship seems to have carried on behind that fence from where Callant left off. I don't know what he's got. The rumors say atomic power that could wreck the coal and oil interests if Winship would let it go. They say gold transmuted out of zirconium that could wreck the world's financial system, if Winship weren't too philanthropic to do it. They say a ship to fly to Mars. Well, I'm fed up with rumor and mystery. I want facts. Get 'em, Lundy, or don't come back." "Yes, Chief," he had said. The fence certainly looked formidable enough. A triple barrier surrounding New Jersey's most inaccessible 1,000 acres. The outer one was of heavy steel mesh, 20 feet high. The next of glistening barbed wire, hung with ominous signs. Danger, 44,000 volts. The inner one was a high wall of sheet steel that shut out the view of everything beyond. "Mr. Carrie Lundoon," he announced himself, "to see Dr. Winship." Seeing the forbidding glint in the eye of the guard, he added impressively, "I'm the science man from the planet for the interview on Dr. Winship's atomic discoveries." The massive and muscular ex-pugilist who defended the gate uttered a porcupine grunt. "Pass," echoed the news hound. He patted the pockets of his immaculate dark suit. "Well, of course he sent me one. Here it is." Grinning cheerfully, he presented the card. The big man inspected it, grunted, and dropped it into a pneumatic tube. 30 seconds later, it dropped back into the receiver. The guard read a note scrawled on it, deliberately tore it in half. "Neat forgery, buddy," he commented, "but the ultraviolet will tell." "Better luck next time," grinned Carrie Lundoon. "My advice, buddy," scowled the guard, "stay away." That night, the moonless sky was overcast. An hour after midnight, a silent plane dipped briefly below the ceiling at 3,000 feet. Carrie Lundoon stepped out of its cabin, caught his breath, and pulled the ripcord of his parachute. The ceaseless throb of a great power plant came up to his ears. Floodlights poured white against the blank mystery of huge windowless buildings. Black shadows clotted clumps of trees. The forbidden 1,000 acres floated toward him. "In," he murmured cheerfully, "and how I get out is their problem." He tugged at the chute's rigging, spilled air to sideslip toward a mysterious construction near the middle of the grounds. It was shaped like a tremendous wheel, 100 feet in diameter and 20 in thickness, lying on its side. Dense shadow made a black pool within its rim. Overalled men were busy under the floodlights outside, loading tools and equipment into trucks. "Eh?" muttered the news hawk. "Something just finished. The Martian flyer, maybe? We'll see. Uprushing air whispered softly against the cords. He sideslipped again. The pool of shadow was beneath him, expanding. He crossed his legs, relaxed for the impact. Hard metal smacked up against him, and the silk fell over his sprawled body. "Greetings," he whispered. "Doc Winship." He unbuckled the harness, kicked off the folds of the parachute, and cautiously rose to his feet in the darkness. A flat metal deck was beneath him. The rim of the wheel made a heavy metal bulwark about the edge. "What is it?" he muttered. "But first thing, a few good pics." Leaning over the massive rim, a tiny automatic camera in his hand, the reporter ignored a sudden powerful throbbing that began beneath him until an avalanche of white-hot agony struck him abruptly, hurled him backward. He sprawled again on the metal deck. It was quivering now to the thrumming beneath. Blue fire of brush discharges danced above the edges of the rim. Lundoon staggered back to his feet. He gasped for breath, felt gingerly of seared hands. The drumming underfoot was steadily louder. He blinked, stared apprehensively around him. What a gosh-awful jolt! Was it wired for me? Not likely. Then what? The space flyer, maybe? Taking off? Panic gripped his heart. He reeled across the quivering deck again to the rim. Another crushing shock hurled him back. Trapped in a wall of electric fire on a ship taking off for Mars. Stark terror galvanized him. The parachute! Its silk would insulate a road to safety. He caught up the white folds in his arms, ran to the weirdly glowing wall, flung them over it. Blue sparks crackled explosively. Flame burst from the silk. The reporter struck at it with bare hands. Another shock flung him back to the throbbing deck. The fall dazed him. When he opened his eyes, a light shone into them. A thick, cylindrical tower, studded with round ports, had risen from the center of the deck. The light was shining from a massive door opening in its side. A man darted out. The reporter had struggled to his feet when the stranger reached his side, gasping, "Come on below, before you're killed!" They stumbled together back into the conning tower. Heavy double doors slid shut behind them. The circular interior of the tower was crowded with unfamiliar glittering instruments. Panting, the stranger touched some control, and a humming mechanism lowered them into the hub of the wheel. Carrie Lundoon stared bewilderedly at his rescuer. This was a tall, thin man whose thick, shaggy hair seemed prematurely white, for his skin looked ruddy and youthful. His face was lean and haggard. His blue eyes were hollow, shadowed like wells of secret agony. "I," floundered the reporter. "I don't know what you were doing out there," said the other, "but the reversal field would have killed you in 2 minutes more." Lundoon got his breath and tried to be coherent. "I'm a newspaperman," he offered. "I was looking for Dr. Winship for an interview about his discoveries." A brief, quizzical smile lit that strangely haggard face. "I'm Dr. Winship," the thin man said, "and there will be time for all the interviews you like before we get back." "Get back?" echoed Lundoon with increased alarm. "We aren't going—" He had to gulp. "Going to Mars?" "No," said the thin man. "Then where?" Panic seized the reporter. "Stop it!" His voice was almost a scream. "You've got to let me off!" Winship gravely shook his white head and glanced at a bank of quivering gauges. "Sorry, Mr. Reporter," he said, "but it's too late to stop." That oddly whimsical smile touched his thin lips again. You came for news? Well, this trip will make plenty of it. Where? Desperate urgency screamed in Lundoon's voice. Where are we going? Winship inspected his dials again, cocked his white head to listen expertly to the throbbing machinery. He nodded, at last, turning back to Lundoon. There'll be an hour or so, he said, while the field is building up. After all, we're in it together, and alone. I may as well tell you. The bright, hollow eyes glittered at Lundoon, excited, feverish. The Phantom Queen is bound for another universe. Chapter 2. The Inverse Universe. The lean, haggard scientist opened the double-sliding doors through which they had entered the conning tower. Now, since the tower had been lowered again, it gave into the interior of the great wheel, a circular space filled with huge, unfamiliar, throbbing machinery. Living quarters were partitioned off. Winship peered out anxiously at the immense machines. Uneasily, Lundoon was pondering what the other had said. His mind reeled from incredulous questions, and a terrible loneliness began to haunt him, for obviously they were alone. But Winship looked at him again with a grave understanding. It's strange, I know, he said. I'll tell you about it. The newshawk nodded gratefully. Dr. Cedric Callant was the greatest scientist the world has seen, began the thin man. You are familiar with many of his discoveries, but not with the greatest of all, the inverse universe. A humble awe came into his solemn voice. That is the supreme achievement of the human mind, but it has the simplicity of all great things. I can give you an idea of it in a few words. His keen eyes shot Lundoon a questioning look. Of course, you understand the atomic theory? Of course, agreed the newshound confidently. The orthodox theories of the atom recognize 6 subatomic particles, Winship said. 3 heavy ones, the negatron, proton, and neutron. 3 light ones, the electron, positron, and neutrino. An ordinary atom, an atom of our positive universe, consists of a nucleus of protons and binding electrons whose net positive charge is balanced by a number of orbital electrons. Callant's geodesics of inversion established the mathematical basis for a universe whose atoms would consist of a nucleus of negatrons and binding positrons whose net negative charge would be balanced by orbital positrons. In other words, minus elements. A complete series from minus hydrogen to minus uranium with atomic numbers and chemical properties determined by the number of orbital positrons. And they make up a minus universe, for Callant's geodesics proved that the world lines of a positive and a negative atom, due to their inverse space warp, can never intersect. Experiment soon confirmed mathematics, and it became Dr. Callant's burning ambition to enter and explore that sister universe. Roger Winship paused to inspect the gauges, make careful adjustments on his elaborate banks of controls. Outside the tower, the mighty thrumming surged deeper again. Lundoon clenched his 2 hands and fought the screaming panic in him. Trapped with a madman, plunging into a foreign universe. He bit his lip, waited. At last, Winship went on. Dr. Callant had a daughter. Her name was Venice. She and I were classmates at Tech. She had some of her father's genius. I came back with her after graduation to share the great research. She was a tall girl, proud and erect as a princess. She had a small, perfect face, fair skin, fine blue eyes, and honey-colored hair. Her quick smile had all the understanding humor in the world. I loved her from the moment I saw her. She liked me, but her father's work came first. For 3 years, we worked to open the door to that other universe. The geodesics were the key. Finally, we hit on the theoretical solution, a special field of terrific intensity whose space warp would make positive atoms unstable, at last disrupt them, causing their energy to seek a new equilibrium in the negative form. The machine we built was disc-shaped, like this, with the atomic-powered field coils in the rim, although smaller and less powerful. We had it almost finished when Dr. Callant unexpectedly sent me to Europe to have a piece of equipment made. A cable from him was waiting at the hotel in Paris. It ran, "Roger, forgive my fraud. Risk too great for all. We're going today. If anything happens, do what you can. Venice will go. She says goodbye." That same day I read in the newspapers that Dr. Callant and his daughter had been killed in a terrific laboratory explosion. I was heartbroken, but I returned at once and tried to find out what had happened. The laboratory was completely wrecked. Some imperfection of the field, I thought, must merely have disrupted the atoms instead of transforming them. Working side by side with Callant for 3 years, I had learned a good deal about his unpublished discoveries. Now, hoping it would help me forget, I set out to complete his work and record it for the benefit of science. I was having the laboratory rebuilt when an obsession began to haunt me, the belief that Venice Callant somehow was still alive. I had peculiar dreams in which I saw her beckoning, gesturing. Her lovely face was white, strained. She was lost and helpless, trying to communicate with me. Dr. Callant had done some work years before toward identifying thought as a radiogen phenomenon, a subatomic radiation. Following that clue, in a direction that somehow came to me in those dreams, I made the psychode. The thin man paused again in that small drumming space, took down a queer-looking helmet from the wall, and fitted it to his white head. A great horseshoe tube arched above the crown, its electrodes against his temples. Golden flame burned through it when he touched a knob. "It picks up thought energy," he explained, "amplifies it regeneratively, heterodyned upon ultra waves, and rebroadcasts it, thus serving as both receiver and transmitter for telemental communication." A strange, burning eagerness in their hollow depths, his tortured eyes peered far beyond Carrie Lundoon, beyond the walls of the metal tower. "I put it on the day it was done," he said, "and waited." His low voice sank until the newshound leaned forward to hear. "The white vision of Venice Callant came to me again, and I was able, for the first time, to understand her." The scientist paused a moment, reminiscent. "Dear Roger," she was calling to me, he resumed. "Can you hear? I'm alive, lost in the other universe. Father was killed. I'm all alone. It's so terrible, so strange. Can you hear me, Roger? Will you come?" "Yes, Venice," I shouted in the empty, dark laboratory. "I hear you. I'll come if I can." I thought she smiled. Then her shadow was gone. His thin hands trembling, Roger Winship replaced the helmet on the wall. His feverish eyes inspected the dials again, peered out at the mighty drumming machines already hurling them into ominous enigma. "That day," he said, "I began the effort to duplicate all Dr. Callant's work so that I could reach the inverse universe to rescue the woman I loved. The difficulties were tremendous. The geodesics of inversion, the greatest single triumph of the human mind, I had memorized, but terrific problems rose in their application and in avoiding the error that had caused the first disaster. A few times, briefly, I spoke to Venice again. She tried, fearfully, to tell me of some other being she had encountered, but she knew no more of her father's work than I. She couldn't help. There was a financial problem, too. Millions were needed, and I was penniless. Callant had made me his heir. He left no money, but I was able to work out profitable applications of his brilliant discoveries. I struggled with one obstacle and another, and the years went by." Roger Winship sighed wearily, a worn man with the lines of agony on his emaciated cheeks. His tortured, restless eyes scanned the dials again. "A long battle," he whispered. "But at last the Phantom Queen was done, ready for the voyage of rescue. Loyal men had worked beside me for years, but they all had ties, obligations, or fears. I started tonight, alone. There was a noise on the deck." The glittering eyes dwelt upon Carrie Lundoon. "And I found you, a stowaway." Staring, trembling, the reporter opened his dry mouth, swallowed twice. At last he could speak. "And we're already going?" Eyes on the dials, Roger Winship nodded gravely. "The atomic generators are feeding 9 million kilowatts into the coils," he said. "The reversal field has already reached 6 billion Callant volts. A little more, I don't know how much, and we shall undergo the atomic inversion into the negative universe. Or else, if I have failed, we shall be destroyed in a stupendous explosion of atomic energy." "If," whispered Lundoon, "if we live, what then?" "If we are still alive," the haggard man said, "we shall search for Venice Callant. The Psychode, I hope, will guide us to her, and the reversal coils, at a different frequency, generate an unidirectional field that serves for propulsion in space." Surging up against the barrier of Lundoon's fear came a quick tide of sympathy for this slight man who had struggled so long toward a goal so difficult. He offered his hand. "Here's hoping, Doc," he said, "that you find her." Then his newspaper instincts were suddenly awake. What a story! He was fumbling for notebook and pencil, thinking sadly of his lost camera, when Winship's cry came to him, sharp and urgent. "Lie down!" Lundoon flung himself to the floor of the conning tower. He was suddenly aware of a terrific strain that racked every atom of his body. There was a sudden, appalling darkness, soon rent with searing flame. Every nerve shrieked with agony, for every atom, literally, was being torn asunder. The ship lurched and spun as if swept before a black tidal wave. Then it was ended. The pain receded. A soft little cry sobbed from the lips of Carrie Lundoon. He dragged himself to his feet, wiped cold sweat from his face. Roger Winship was white and swaying, but a quiet light of victory shone in his hollow eyes. He touched a key, and the mighty thrum of the generators was suddenly silenced. "It is done," he whispered, shakenly. "Field potential 0. We have been revibrated safely into the minus universe." His trembling hand reached for the psychode helmet. "Now, Venice!" Chapter 3. The Giant of Cubes. Humming motors were lifting the conning tower again. Through the circular deck, Carrie Lundoon clung to a handrail, speechless, staring incredulously through a port. For the high-fenced field was gone. He looked into a void of velvet darkness. The darkness was laced with an incredible web of shining rays. Strange worlds, shimmering like jewels of 1,000 colors, were strung upon those threads of living light. "The world is gone," he whispered. "Everything gone." Roger Winship reeled bewilderedly to a thick-barreled telescope. He kept his eyes against its oculars for a long time. His face became lax and white with dread. Lundoon's apprehensive curiosity became ungovernable. What do you see?" he stammered. "I don't understand it," came the scientist's dismayed whisper. "Nothing bright enough to be a sun, yet all these bodies are luminous. There were no planetary systems, but queer worlds strung on shining rays." "What can we do?" demanded the reporter. Can we go back?" Roger Winship's thin face was stern with purpose. "We'll search for Venice," he said. "She's here somewhere in this madness, alone." He adjusted the golden horseshoe of the psychode helmet on his head and stood rigid beside the telescope. His eyes closed. It was eerily and ominously still. Waiting in a maddening tensity of anxiety, Lundoon peered outside again. Below and above this strange space was the same, a lace of light woven against the darkness, sewn with tiny jewels of worlds. He put his eyes to the telescope and trembled to the strangeness of another discovery. These were no natural planets. One was an opal globe, but another was a white cube. The third, an emerald tetrahedron. The fourth, an amber rod. A great disk of flaming magenta came across the field, a fiery wheel rolling on a ribbon of purple light. It receded and vanished. A bright green ellipsoid came back, devouring the purple road as it came. It passed, huge for a moment as the moon, and also vanished. What manner of universe was this? Staggering back from the instrument, the reporter passed a trembling hand across his forehead. Here was evidence of order, of law. But what uncanny order? What incredible law? Roger Winship, beneath the psychode's fantastic crown, uttered a low, gasping cry. Hastily, he took the thing from his head. His face looked white, stricken. "Venice?" whispered Lundoon. "Did she speak?" "No," said the thin man, his face still shadowed with some unutterable dread. "But a strange mind reached me. It commands us to land upon the nearest planet." "But you won't obey," protested Lundoon apprehensively. "You don't know what sort of being. It may be dangerous." "But I shall obey," said Winship. "It is the only clue." He touched the control board. The generators started again, their throb now more gentle than upon the inter-universal voyage. The opal sphere drifted nearer. It was a strange ball of luminescence, perfect, many-hued. It was splendid against the velvet dark. No fewer than 6 incandescent threads, ranging in color from frozen blue to a dull, smoky crimson, joined it to the web of worlds. Queer! Winship was at the telescope again. A perfect globe, 2,000 miles in diameter. No trace of atmosphere, no mountains, no seas, nothing like a city, no sign whatever of life or intelligence, just a bare, shining ball. What could it have been? The reporter said huskily. That spoke to you. We shall see. The Phantom Queen proved swifter than Lundoon had thought possible. The strange world ahead grew. It was like a vast bubble of frosty incandescence, expanding. Winship touched his keys again. The drum of the generators softened. The disk tilted so that the planet was beneath. It dropped toward a brilliant convex horizon. Softly, they landed. The dark sky above was veiled with wondrous woven rays. A hard, flat plain shimmered away from the ship. It was absolutely featureless, nowhere broken. A thin strand of blinding green fire leaped up beyond the flat horizon, ran straight to a tiny, cone-shaped world of red. With a trembling hand, Winship was pointing out at that level of mingled diamond light. "Look," he quavered. "It's crystalline, in the cubic system." Peering down at the plane, as near the ship as he could, Lundoon saw that it was all composed of tiny, identical cubes, carefully laid to form a tile-like surface. "Well, that's so, but—" His throat stuck, for the shimmering plane had heaved up, as if hurled by an explosive blast. A cloud of little diamond blocks came flying toward the ship. They rained down upon the flat circular deck, outside the conning tower, and they fell in a very curious way. Lundoon had seen that each 1-inch cube was joined to 8 of its fellows by tiny threads of incandescence that ran from corner to corner. And they didn't fall at random on the deck, but piled themselves into a grotesque mockery of the human form. It looked like something a child might have built with 1,000,000 nursery blocks. It towered 20 feet tall. It was weirdly terrible. One stride brought it to the observation tower. The ship shuddered to its weight. A thin rope of bright yellow fire ran from it back over the rail to the hole it had left in the plane, joining these cubes to the others there. The face of it was outside the ports. The reporter stared at it with a sick fascination. Hard, bright cubes, strung together with threads of fire, made a massive nose, bulging, many-faceted eyes, the square travesty of a chin. The thing looked like the creation of a surrealist sculptor gone mad, and it was infinitely horrible. A fantastic arm of cubes came up, made some incomprehensible gesture. "It's alive!" sobbed Carrie Lundoon. "The whole planet is alive!" Roger Winship looked at him for a moment with a torture of uncertainty in his hollow blue eyes. Then, slowly, he began to put on the headset of the psychode. "I think it wants to talk to us," he said. He seemed to listen. His thin face went suddenly white. Beads of sweat burst out and gathered into glistening droplets that rolled down his lined cheeks. "No," he whispered. I won't do it. I want to find Venice. I want her more than anything, but I won't do that." In a fever of apprehension, Lundoon caught his arm. "What is it?" he demanded. "What does it want?" But the scientist, absorbed in his battle with the grotesquerie of cubes, paid him no heed, and Carrie Lundoon turned suddenly to the ports again. For that nightmare giant had stepped back across the deck. A second eruption of cubes opened a greater hole in the plain behind it. These also rained upon the deck, but they changed as they fell. Bars of yellow gold laid themselves in glittering stacks. Massive ingots piled themselves, gleaming with the blue-white of platinum, the blue-gray of osmium, the brilliant white of pure radium. Great blocks fell into walls, flashing with the green of emerald, hot scarlet of rubies, prismatic splendor of diamonds. That precious, incredible rain continued until the ship was laden with treasure beyond all calculation, and Roger Winship stood motionless inside the conning tower, the golden horseshoe still burning on his head, mute agony twisting his thin face. "Millions!" gasped the reporter. "That's worth billions if it's real." Still the scientist seemed not to hear him. The dull voice spoke again, gray, weary. "No, I won't do it. All this is less to me than Venice, but I won't do it even for her. I tell you, I won't." His voice had risen almost to a scream. Suddenly Winship wrenched the helmet off, dropped trembling on the stool behind the control board. Lundoon gripped his shoulder. "What did it want?" he asked in a voice hoarse with urgency. Dull and bloodshot, unutterably weary, Winship's hollow eyes looked up at his face. "It wanted me to reveal the inversion geodesics," his dull voice said. "Dr. Callant's greatest discovery, the key to the gate between the universes." "Why?" Cold dread had already stiffened the journalist when Winship spoke. "There could be but one reason, that it desires to invade our own universe. Therefore I refused. It offered me all the treasure stacked outside, transmuted it out of its own substance. It offered to lead me to Venice and surrender her to me, safe and alive." His voice was hoarse with pain. "But still I refused." "Now what?" Lundoon demanded apprehensively. "Can we go back?" Winship shook his white head. "I don't think so. We're in its power. There would be no time to build up the reversal field. Besides, I'm afraid to try. It can't discover the geodesics from any examination of the ship, but it might read them from my mind if we tried to return and follow." The reporter's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. "What?" he faltered. "What is going to happen?" Winship shrugged thin shoulders, hopelessly. "We'll be killed, I suppose. Probably not very pleasantly. The thing threatened to destroy us if I didn't reveal the geodesics. There's nothing we can do." The haggard head sank forward on his arms. Carrie Lundoon turned unsteadily again to the ports. The precious stacks of metal and gems still lay on the deck, with that fantastic giant behind it. But something was happening to the treasure. A rope of white fire had run to it from the pit in the plain. At the ends of raveled incandescent threads, metal ingots and crystal blocks were flowing, changing back to hard, bright cubes. And the change didn't stop with the treasure. Bright filaments stabbed against the steel of the ship. Glowing knots formed at their ends, grew swiftly into cubes like the rest. The metal was pitted, consumed. "It's eating the ship!" Roger Winship gasped. "We've got to get away!" A dull weariness still in him, the scientist stirred himself heavily, tapped at the control keys. The machinery throbbed again. The Phantom Queen lifted from that bright plane into a flame-veiled space. But the cloud of newborn cubes rose about them. The joining strands of fire stretched endlessly, and still the consuming threads attacked the ship. Winship dropped his white head again, hopelessly. "We are helpless," he whispered. "There is nothing we can do." Chapter 4. Mock Sun. Carrie Lundoon turned away, shuddering from the swift, uncanny destruction of the deck. Frantically, his eyes searched the conning tower, fell upon the psychode helmet, which Winship had thrown aside after his failure to communicate with Venice Callant. With trembling hands, the reporter set it on his head, snapped on the switch to light the horseshoe tube. He felt a curious, tingling shock from the cold metal electrodes against his temples. "Help!" he began to shout. "Help! Before we die!" Suddenly, then, crawling images of uttermost malevolence filled his mind. Somehow they were rendered into words, perhaps by his own mind, as if a mocking, evil voice were saying, "No one will help you, little being, for you two are alone. You know not the secret, and the other will not speak. Therefore you both must perish, unless you will cause the other to reveal the inversion geodesics." That was the way out, Lundoon perceived. Attack Winship, beat him, torture him, force him to reveal the secret. He was amazed at the sudden, virulent hatred that filled him. Winship was a murderer. He was about to kill them both. And this being of the cubes was merely strange, not really evil. Lundoon knew somehow that he was snatching a pair of heavy binoculars from beside a port. He swung them over the bowed white head. Knock him out. That was it. Bind him, then twist his fingers, burn his toes, make him tell, "Wait!" Another strange voice seemed to speak through the helmet. It was like the peal of a silver bugle, clear, imperative. "Wait, for I am coming." And the thin man looked up, startled. He ducked the blow. His white head butted into Lundoon's middle. The reporter struck again, savagely. "Get him!" The first voice overwhelmed the other. "Make him tell!" Winship's groping hand caught the helmet, jerked it from the reporter's head. Carrie Lundoon staggered back against the wall, suddenly weak and faint with the horror of what he had tried to do. "Sorry, Doc," he gasped. "Somehow, it got me." The pale, haggard face smiled at him, wanly. "I understand, Lundoon. I met it a while ago." Breathing hard, he sat wearily back on the stool. Fingers fumbled automatically in his pocket. "Smoke?" Lundoon accepted and lit a cigar. Then he remembered something. There was another voice. Something else is coming. He looked outside again. Still bright cubes swarmed above the deck, still thrust their filaments against the heavy steel, transforming it to other cubes. But suddenly the light of the terrible swarm grew dim. Bright threads snapped. The cubes swept away from the ship like a flock of frightened birds, and another thing darted down, hung poised outside the conning tower. No larger than a man's head, it was a mirror-polished globe. Its surface reflected in miniature the strange veil of fire across the sky. It tapped gently against a port, as if seeking entry. Winship, beside him, was staring at the sphere. "It's all right, Doc," Lundoon assured him. "It drove away the cubes." Winship put on the psychode. The tube flamed golden again. His haggard face smiled, and Lundoon listened once more to half a strange conversation. "Yes," said Winship, "the thing of cubes is our enemy. We came to this universe to seek one of our own kind." His voice went hoarse with amazement. "Yes, Venice Callant. You know her? Energy? Yes, we have energy to spare. I'll let you through the lock." His white face turned to Lundoon. "It knows Venice," he whispered. "It says that it has escaped from a prison in which they were together." The silver globe had vanished from the port. Winship touched the buttons which controlled the double sliding doors. The inner one opened, and the sphere flitted into the conning tower, quick and silent as the image of a trembling mirror. And Carrie Lundoon, standing near the yellow horseshoe of the psychode, was aware of faint thought images, eagerly hopeful. "Energy? Energy for me? Plenty of it," Winship said. "Millions of kilowatts from the atomic generators. But tell me about Venice." Unconsciously, Lundoon had become aware that his cigar was extinct. Automatically, for all his mind was filled with the wonder of that argent bubble, he thumbed a pocket lighter, raised it. He was astounded when the bubble leaped like a moth at the tiny flame. It hovered above the light, and suddenly its silvery film was hidden in a mist of rainbow color. "A splendid thing," came Winship's awed whisper. "A perfect parhelion." "Parhelion?" The reporter, puzzled at the word, recalled that it meant a mock sun, a sun dog. Faintly, then, the thought forms of the little being. "Energy is good. Mock sun is grateful, for he was starved for energy in the prison." "Welcome, mock sun," Winship said eagerly. "But where is Venice? Tell me about her." Lundoon could catch nothing more of the swift emanation of thought from the sphere. Rapt wonder had seized Winship's pallid face. His hushed voice asked swift questions. "Where is the prison? What is this thing of cubes? Can we fight it?" Lundoon waited in a fever of impatience. "What is it?" he demanded once. "What does it say?" But Winship seemed unconscious of him. The sphere still danced in its haze of color above the lighter's flame. It seemed a long time before it turned silver again, darted upward. Winship bent suddenly over the controls, and the Phantom Queen throbbed into motion again. "Where are we going?" Lundoon questioned. "What did it tell you?" "A great deal," said Winship's awed voice. "An amazing story." He adjusted the controls. The generators drummed louder. The far-off web of colored rays crept visibly past the ports. Impatiently, Lundoon insisted, "Tell me." "This universe was once pretty much the counterpart of our own, so I gather," Winship began. "Its matter condensed into galaxies, suns, and planets. Life was born, became intelligent, extended its sway over matter. Upon one planet sprang up a race of scientists. Two of them, brothers, became the supreme minds of this universe, grappling with the few great problems their race had not solved. They first sought eternal life. One of them, our guest, who had conveniently elected the name Mach Sun, achieved the goal through a mastery of space and time, his brother being sought it in another way, through control of energy and matter. It revised its entire physical organization and gradually made itself able to transmute and assimilate matter in unlimited amounts. It devoured all the others of its race, save Mach Sun. It devoured all the life on the planet. Then it transmuted and consumed the material of the very world itself. It stretched out the radiant tubes of force that might be called its nerves to other planets, even to their parent star, and transformed them also into the hard eternal cubes of fixed material energy that were its life cells. Its greed was insatiable. It spread from star to star, across all the galaxy. It consumed everything it touched, from suns to meteoric dust. It reached a shining arm to the next galaxy, spread to others. In the end, all the matter in this universe continuum had been consumed, all save the body of its brother being. It attacked him also. But Mach Sun protected himself. He created this silvery shield, walling himself, in fact, into a tiny subspace manifold of his own. Mass is not always indicative of quality. The conquering entity suspected the existence of our twin universe and desired in its infinite greed to enter and devour it. But for all its giant bulk, it was unable to discover the geodesics of inversion. The keener mind of Mach Sun had long since mastered them. However, recognizing the infinite evil of the other, he refused to reveal them. Demanding them, the other confined him, cut off the energy he needed to live. Venice, when the experiment hurled her into this universe 15 years ago, was thrown into the same prison, still aboard the ship but unable to operate it. They have been together. The psychode made them aware of our arrival. Mach Sun escaped. He has some power left against the other, and he came to guide us to Venice. Suddenly the silver bubble was darting, as if with alarm, from port to port. Looking out apprehensively, Carrie Lundoon saw an ominous thing. The shining web that veiled the dark sky was tightening, the queer living worlds drawing in about them. "It's closing in," he gasped. Hastily, Winship adjusted the psychode again. Intent with listening, his face went ashen white. "Mach Sun says that the infinite entity has discovered his escape," he whispered in dismay, "and terminated a sort of truce they had made. Now all its power is against us." Chapter 5. Universe Lost. Roger Winship's drawn, hollow face showed no fear. An eagerness of hope was burning in his feverish eyes. "It has been 15 years. His low voice was anxious and wistful. "If I could only see her again before the finish, I should ask for nothing more." Carrie Lundoon was peering out, fearfully. A scene of terrible wonder met his gaze. Burning against velvet dark, bound together with cords of flame, strange worlds were crowding thick about them, various as to shape and color, fantastic as a madman's dream. A rope of hot red fire leaped at them suddenly, like a striking snake from the center of a violet planetary ring. The end of it raveled out into a million wire-like strands. These incandescent filaments shot to the deck. Bright cubes grew swiftly at their extremities, and the metal wasted again. The reporter turned suddenly from it. He caught the silver bubble between his two hands. He chatted fearfully. Could you help us?" But Winship, with the helmet on his head, said hopelessly, "We're lost. Mach's son cannot use the power that he has. He can't now even guide us to Venice. And there, the air." Lundoon looked out again, in time to see a black hole yawn in the pitted deck. Outrushing air condensed into a tenuous cloud of frost, and the frost was gathered into a glittering cube. Nothing escaped the hunger of the universal being. Rigid with the terror of death, the reporter saw a bright filament stab against the port. He saw the thick quartz transformed into little hard cubes, bright with opalescent gleams, and then the port was open. The air exploded outward. Lundoon was hurled against the wall. Breath sighed out of his bursting lungs. Agony swelled his heart. The hammer of his pulse was deafening. He felt the hot rush of blood in his nostrils. His ears tasted its salty sweetness in his mouth. Pressed from their sockets by fiendish fingers, his eyes went blind. Terrible fingers closed on his throat. His empty lungs labored in vain. He staggered, fell. And in that last terrible moment, he thought he felt incandescent filaments burning against his body to transform it also into hard, tiny cubes. But awareness came back to him out of a queer dream in which he was winged, soaring above the towers of New York. He could breathe again. He opened his aching eyes and discovered Winship near him and the silver globe of Mach sun. They were all floating together in a queer, transparent bubble. The wreckage of the Phantom Queen was a little distance away. Lundoon watched its last fragment dissolve into a little swarm of bright cubes, laced together with shining wires. The strange worlds beyond still were gathering. Winship, the psychode still on his head, floated up from the bottom of the 12-foot crystal bubble. "What?" gasped the reporter. "How? Mach son was able to use his power after all," the thin man said. "He made this transparent shield. It is akin to his own subspace barrier. He filled it with oxygen so that we can breathe. The cubes cannot enter it, and he can move it so that we can continue the search for Venice." Even as Winship spoke, the bubble darted away at a speed far greater than the Phantom Queen had attained. The bright, living web was brushed backward. They plunged into a gulf of darkness, so vast that the clustered worlds were lost. "The prison," Winship rendered Mach sun's message. "A space drained of all energy." The bubble came, at last, to a sudden halt. Roger Winship pointed abruptly out through its pellucid film, uttering a soft, choked cry. Staring, Lundoon saw, drifting beside them, a battered disk of steel, a smaller Phantom Queen. "That's Callant's first machine," sobbed Winship. "Where Venice is." The reporter saw a woman's face looking through the round port of an airlock in the rim. A thin face, pale and anguished. Its violet eyes were wells of tortured loneliness. Horror unspeakable had marked it, yet somehow it was still beautiful. "Venice!" Winship was shouting. "Venice! darling!" The woman beckoned. The bubble floated closer to the valve. She vanished, flung it open. Escaping air hurled her out. She struck the shimmering wall, and somehow it let her in. A throbbing ache closed Lundoon's throat to watch that reunion. Roger Winship caught the exile's frail hands with both of his. They stared for a moment at each other, on both their faces a startled, half-incredulous wonder. "Roger," whispered the woman, "you came." She burst suddenly into tears. Winship made a little choked sound and drew her very tenderly toward him, and abruptly they clung together, desperately. Then the little silver ball of mock sun was suddenly darting about the bubble. It bumped gently against Winship's head. He turned from the woman to adjust the psychode. "Followed?" the scientist gasped. Indeed, far off in the black gulf, the reporter saw a comet-like body, a bright spark racing toward them, trailing a path of flame. Lundoon was still staring, fearfully, when Winship touched his arm. "Get your breath," he said. "We're going back." "Back?" Lundoon was incredulous. "Back to Earth? How?" "Mock Sun has mastered the geodesics," Winship said, "and we are still so far away that he can shield the process from the enemy." "When?" Lundoon gasped. But Winship had already made a warning gesture, and the reporter was overwhelmed again with racking torture, as if every atom of his body were crushed by inconceivable forces, the agony of the reversal field. It ended, and he was amazed to find himself sprawled on the ground. He staggered to his feet, bewildered. The sky was blue above. The genial rays of a familiar sun fell across clumps of green trees and great white-walled buildings. Fresh-mowed grass was crisp underfoot. The warm air shuddered to the distant mundane whistle of a locomotive. This was Earth again. Home! They were back in the well-fenced grounds of the Callant Memorial Foundation, he recognized, from which the Phantom Queen had carried them. Roger Winship was helping Venice to her feet at his side. Mock Sun was bounding about over the grass like a silver ball. "We're home," sighed the weary man, happily. "After 15 years. Venice, my darling. Ah!" Lundoon heard the sudden croak of horror in Winship's voice. He turned. Consternation froze him. For the thin, white-headed scientist was retreating from the woman he had rescued. His hands were lifted, his gaunt face ashen and rigid with dread. The woman had laughed, mockingly. The laughter changed to a sound not human. Her slim body altered suddenly. It became a fantastic grotesquerie of hard, bright cubes. "Venice!" Winship gasped. "Why, Venice!" Beyond them, the silver globe of Mock Sun had dissolved into a cluster of glittering cubes. Already they were feeding on the grass. Bright filaments writhed from their corners down against the turf, absorbed it to grow new cubes. The fantastic thing that had been Venice Callant dissolved into a swarm of little opalescent blocks that fell like locusts on the trees and grass. Roger Winship staggered back against the bole of a tree, wiping horror sweat from his gray, stricken face. "What a fool!" he whispered. "What a fool I was!" "What?" Lundoon gasped. "What happened?" "A trick," came Winship's rasping voice. "It was all a hoax, designed to destroy our universe. In the attack on the Phantom Queen, When we were unconscious, the entity recaptured Mach's son. But Mach's son helped us. The thing that helped us, or pretended to, was a counterfeit Mach's son made to deceive us. It was easy for the entity that has absolute mastery of matter. The counterfeit led us not to Venice, but to another duplication, and so unwittingly we brought back the seed of the monster to destroy our universe. Chapter 6. Infinite Illusion. The change which overwhelmed the world took place with a frightful and progressively increasing rapidity. Each cubic life cell of the invader, when grown, could send out 7 new filaments from 7 corners to start new ones. The grass and trees within the high-fenced enclosure were soon transformed to gleaming blocks. The white buildings fell, and then the fence. Trees and stacks in the distance crumbled. Inequalities were leveled. The earth, to the limit of vision, was soon a glittering opalescent pave. The workmen and technicians employed by the Foundation, with their families, had lived in a model community village which occupied one end of the 1,000 acres. The fate of those neat homes was a scene of typical horror. Screaming men, hysterical women, wailing children, all fled vainly from the terror of the cubes. Overtaken, struck ruthlessly down by conglomerate hammers, they were swiftly turned to bright cubes themselves, and so rose to pursue the rest. Lundoon had momentarily expected the death of Winship and himself. Surely their lives had no value to the entity, and since Earth was lost, their fate seemed to matter not at all. But they were spared. The turf was consumed beneath their feet. A shrieking mechanic running toward them fell and was consumed almost at their feet. But they were left at the end, standing alone on a glistening plain of diamond blocks. The world was flat, presently, to the level horizon. Nothing broke the glittering surface, and Lundoon saw a rope of purple flame leap out across the westward sky toward the waning moon. He watched its mottled silver change to a poison green. He saw other fiery shafts arrow from it to consume yet other worlds. "It is done," he whispered. "But were we spared?" He looked at Roger Winship, haggard, disheveled man, sunk in weary, heart-crushed apathy. The scientist shook his white head, fantastic, with the psychode still upon it. He made no reply. Lundoon gripped his arm in sudden panic. For the shining plain had heaved up before them. A rising cloud of cubes left a ragged pit. They clustered together to form, once more, a grotesque, gigantic, man-like shape. It came toward them, still bound to the pit behind it. Standing before it, Winship adjusted the psychode, listened, and Lundoon was suddenly absorbed by the expression on the face of the scientist. His despair and horror seemed to ebb away. A grim smile played for a moment across his lined features, and Winship shook his head. The gigantic thing tramped nearer. Its great arms flailed threateningly. Colossal feet crushed down, almost catching the 2 men, and Roger Winship smiled again. "Nothing doing, sweetheart," he said softly. He slipped off the helmet and stood idly swinging it in his hand. The bewildered reporter caught his arm. "Now what is it?" he asked. Roger Winship made a cheerfully careless gesture at the appalling giant. "It informs me that Venice is still alive," he said. "Still in the ship that we saw, imitated so expertly. and it will carry me back to the other universe to join her, if only I will disclose the inversion geodesics. It can do no harm to spill the geodesics now, the entity argues, because our universe is wiped out anyhow, and still it needs them. Otherwise, it is forever cut in twain. It is offering, therefore, to take us back to Venice, and to let us live out our natural lives there in the ship, if only we tell. If we don't, torture for both of us until we do. Lundoon saw nothing to be so cheerful about. His throat was rough and dry, but finally a husky whisper came. "Well, why not tell, if it can't hurt?" Wearily, Roger Winship smiled. "Mass doesn't always mean quality. Among the largest brains ever weighted was that of a congenital idiot. The entity has set a very elaborate stage and produced a very impressive illusion. But there's one obvious flaw." "Illusion?" gasped the reporter. "Flaw?" "It is obvious," said Roger Winship, "that we have not been returned to our own universe. Therefore, we have not seen Earth destroyed." "But we did," began Lundoon. "We thought we did, but we know that the entity is a master of matter. We have seen that its substance at will can be molded and transmuted into any form. More significant, we know too that the psychode, amplifying any thought, is a powerful adjunct to hypnotic suggestion." Lundoon glanced fearfully up at the threatening monster of cubes. "But this was the Earth," he insisted. "Mach's son brought us back." "That's the flaw," said Winship. "The real Mach's son knew the inversion geodesics, but the counterfeit that returned us was a part of the entity, and the entity doesn't know them. Therefore, we weren't brought back." Lundoon gasped, his head spinning. When he looked up at the darkening sky, he saw that its flame-veiled wonder had indeed grown curiously familiar. This world might very well be the opal planet where they had first landed. He peered in bewildered apprehension at the fantastic giant. That, anyhow, was real, menacing. But suddenly the little blocks that formed it turned black and began to fall apart. They clattered down like shattering black glass upon the plain, and the plain itself was darkened. A circle of blackness ran out like a ripple from where the monster fell. It expanded to the flat horizon. A shadow was cast upon the veil of flame above. The colored sparks of worlds were quenched in darkness. A dim purple twilight fell upon them, and Lundoon shivered to the chill of universal doom. "It must be dying," he whispered. "But why?" A disk of battered metal came plunging out of that void of deepening purple, slowed itself, settled softly toward them. "Callant's old machine!" cried Winship. "Or else the counterpart we saw." It landed beside them on the glassy, darkened plain. A valve opened in its rim. A familiar small globe of silver darted out, tapped against the helmet swinging from Winship's hand. He put it on, lit the golden horseshoe, listened. "If you are Mach's son," he said, "repeat the inversion geodesics." "Good. And where is Venice? What has happened to the entity?" Consumed with wonder, the reporter studied Winship's lean face. It went lax with amazement. It was suddenly bright with eagerness, then clouded with sorrow. Tears welled out of the weary eyes, ran down hollow cheeks. The purple dusk, meantime, grew deeper, as if, Lundoon thought, all light was being quenched from this universe. He shivered to an increasing chill. The air seemed very thin. His lungs were laboring. And something, he thought, was the matter with Mach Sun. Little irregular patches of darkness appeared and vanished on its bright silver. At last it sank, as if weary, upon the black pave. Winship slowly looked away toward the machine. Lundoon caught his arm, rapped out insistent questions. "Yes, this is the real Mach Sun who was in prison with Venice," he said. "He has destroyed the entity, the being that was his brother. He did it with a subtle transformation of the space warp so that it is no longer an adequate medium for the other's vital energy. Mach Sun had possessed the weapon for a long time, but they were brothers, alone together. Mach Sun, in a way that perhaps we can never understand, loved the other. He forgave it all its crimes, even his own imprisonment and torture. Mach Sun was near death, he says, when Venice was thrown into the same prison. She kept him alive with the heat radiated from her own body. They were together 15 years. Mach Sun, it seems, came to feel something more than gratitude, for it was for her sake at last, to ensure the safety of the world she loved, that he killed the other being." In the thickening purple darkness, Winship looked down at the small globe lying at their feet. Larger patches of black were flickering across its silver. "It is difficult to follow the emotions of an alien being," Winship said, "but Mach Sun is ill, perishing, not from any physical necessity, I think, but because his heart is broken by what he has done." A sharp, brittle snap drew Lundoon's eyes to his feet. The silver sphere was gone. A minute, naked body quivered where it had been and lay still. Wonderingly, they bent over it. At first it resembled the form of a tiny man. In a moment, however, it had crumbled to a pinch of gray dust. Presently, Winship got slowly and stiffly back to his feet. "Come aboard," he said. "The ship is uninjured. We can return to Earth." The rusted valve closed behind them. They came through the lock into the machine. Winship stopped with a soft cry of breathless joy and then ran unsteadily forward, for a woman had been waiting for him. Swaying to meet him, she looked thin and frail. Her hair was completely white. Her violet eyes were shadowed with the horror of her long exile, but happiness was a radiant light in them now. "Roger," she whispered, "you have come." Lundoon walked softly past them into the control room of the ship that now could take them safely back. His practiced mind was searching already for the fitting lead for his story that would scoop the world.